And this poor guy was fined $100 for that. So that's what the legislation was about. And as I say, Jefferson feared that it would be used in a partisan way. And if you actually look at Section 2 of the Sedition Act of 1798, it is quite clear that you are not to criticize the president, and you are not to criticize either house of Congress, and so on and so forth. But it skips right over the vice president. You can say anything you want to about him. He belongs to the other party. So, I mean, the partisan nature of this was not exactly being concealed with, with terrific energy. And Jefferson, is not an idiot and could perceive this. But of course, there's much more at stake than merely partisan politics. There's also a constitutional question at stake. Now, modern students today, when they hear the terms of the Sedition Act of 1798, immediately think First Amendment. This is a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. And that was Jefferson's view. But apparently at that time, that was not the majority view. The consensus appears to have been that the First Amendment did not, in fact, protect seditious speech. The understanding was that the First Amendment meant that there was the typical phrase that was used, there's no prior restraint when you go to publish. That is to say, there's no censorship board that's going to prevent you from publishing what you want to publish. So you have free speech. But once that speech gets out there, if it's seditious, well, then you could get in trouble for it. But nobody stopped you from publishing it in the beginning. That was the understanding of what that meant. No prior restraint, but nevertheless, you would be held responsible for your speech if it were, for example, seditious. And in fact, the Sedition Act, in some quarters, was considered to be a liberalization of the understanding of sedition, because, for one thing, truth could be admitted as a defense. You could say, well, yes, I said terrible things about the government, but they do happen to be true. And under this act, you could actually be exonerated if what you said actually was turned out to be true. So Jefferson then fell back on the 10th Amendment, because if the First Amendment was not there's no absolute consensus on seditious speech vis-a-vis the First Amendment, then there's the 10th Amendment. Now, the 10th Amendment is absolutely critical, and I assume people in the room know what the 10th Amendment is, but I'm still going to tell you. Last month I was at a private school in Wisconsin called Brookfield Academy. I had just given a talk the previous night in Milwaukee, and then I spoke to some high schoolers at Brookfield Academy. Well, if you live in Wisconsin, you're listening to this, and you're not sending your children to Brookfield Academy, I don't know what's the matter with you, because this place is unbelievable. I mean, in between classes, instead of a big jungle with, savages screaming and crimes being committed and whatever, people are playing a quick game of chess. Typical dorks just like me. Wonderful. Hope they didn't hear that. I mean that in the best possible endearing sense. But I asked them, each one of the classes I was in, I said, well, what is the 10th? Does anybody know what the 10th Amendment says? 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson said it's the cornerstone of the whole document. Anybody know what it means? I kid you not, I got this answer. The 10th Amendment says that all powers not delegated to the federal government by the states, listed in Article 1, Section 8, and not prohibited to the states, as listed in Article 1, Section 10, are reserved to the states and to the people. Well, after I regained consciousness, I said, congratulations, that's wonderful, that's exactly the answer I want, I'm changing jobs and coming out to Wisconsin, whereas typically, if you ask that in a college classroom, what is the 10th Amendment, you can pretty much hear crickets. Like, no response at all, like, I don't know what you're talking about. They're probably going to give you the 10th commandment or something when you ask them. Well, so the 10th Amendment, according to Jefferson, is the great cornerstone, and it's often said by people that one of the objections that people originally had to the Constitution was that it lacked a Bill of Rights. But more specific than that, it was specifically what a lot of people wanted was something like the 10th Amendment, which was a guarantee of self-government, that the states have only delegated to the federal government those powers that are listed in Article 1, Section 8. They reserve the bulk to themselves. So Jefferson applies this to the Alien and Sedition Acts and says, where did the states delegate to the federal government the power to criminalize these things? Well, nowhere that I can see. I don't see it in Article 1, Section 8. So therefore, the federal government is usurping a state power. So this is Jefferson's argument against the legislation. Now, what are his options here in terms of this? I mean, certainly states could secede from the Union. Jefferson believed that. It drives people crazy to point that out, so let me say that one more time. Jefferson believed in the right of a state to secede from the Union. He was not crazy, he was not a lunatic, he was a rather intelligent man, and he believed this. But he wanted to make the point that secession would be a move that you would take really only when things had come to an intolerable state. And it would be rash, it would be just premature to consider secession at that moment. But Jefferson did have friends, as some of you well know, like John Taylor, who were advocating secession even in 1798, saying, you know what, obviously this Constitution is not working, we should withdraw, we in Virginia should withdraw from the Union. Jefferson said, this is not yet the time for that, not yet the time for that. So that's too drastic for something just as this. Jefferson could simply counsel submission to the legislation. You know, let's just go along with it. But of course, to Jefferson, this is unthinkable because, you know, after a great effort, we have this Constitution. If we then permit this to take place, an unconstitutional usurpation of state powers, then we've given away the whole store. That's intolerable as well. He could wait for the next election. He could wait for 1800 and just elect a new president who might repeal the legislation. It's set to expire the day before the next president takes office, so you could just wait. But waiting, I mean, who knows at that time how rigorously it's going to be enforced. It turns out it wasn't enforced particularly obnoxiously, but who could know that at that time? And for all Jefferson knows, all the Republican newspaper editors could be languishing in jail by then, so you don't necessarily want to wait. There's also the concern that, of course, elections do not always mean that a wonderful person takes office. You know, I mean, sometimes people vote for dumb people. You know, I mean, I know you just want to just get up and leave that I would say something like that. But sometimes people vote for dumb people. You know, it hasn't happened recently, of course. We haven't had this happen, but this could happen. So you can't wait for that necessarily. And finally, for people who began to take Jefferson's position, which I'm about to lay out what Jefferson finally decided on, the thinking was that if the federal government violates, if some politician, some political leader violates or in some way abuses, let's say, one of the delegated powers, one of the powers that the federal government enjoys under Article I, Section 8, if they abuse one of those powers, then you vote them out. But if they usurp, if they take over one of the state's reserved powers, well, that's not something you just vote somebody out for. I mean, this is something that's a dangerous breach of the constitutional compact, and that needs to be met much more swiftly and more resolutely and more immediately. So Jefferson came up with an idea that became known as nullification.